Hello, everybody. Welcome to Extravaganza 2021. If you haven't been able to join us until now, and welcome to all of those of you who have also maybe participated in our whole event. We're excited to have you here. My name is Heather Hansen. I'm going to be serving as your moderator today, and also supporting today's workshop is Julie Stecker, our tech person, and Becky Cole, our just in case anything else goes wrong person. She helps take care of us and back us up. And we're so glad to see some of you here that are returning faces, all of you that are returning faces, but also you newcomers. We hope you've really gotten a lot out of this event. It's not the same online as it is in person. So hopefully you'll come join us again next year in Minneapolis, but we're glad you're here on Zoom today, especially since this is the first video conferencing and the first video Zoom workshops we've ever done. So you get to be part of something new this year and then new again next year for you. So here's how today's session will proceed. We're going to play a video prepared from our presenter, that's Janelle Hooper, and her topic today is Children Essential to the Kingdom. So if you're here for that workshop, you are in the right place. If you're not, you can still stay. We'd love for you to be here. So we're going to hear a prepared video from her, and then we'll have some time for question and answer. You can send your questions through the chat box at that time. And as you're watching the video, think of some inspiration for questions as well, and then stick those in just as soon as we get off. And then I'll relay those to the presenter. So thanks again for joining us. And we're going to go ahead and start with our first video.
Hi, I'm Pastor Janelle Hooper, Program Director for Ministry with Children for the ELCA. And I'm glad to be sharing with you this workshop, Children Essential to the Kingdom. Picture it. Jesus and others had recently come down the mountain after a transfiguration and transformational, life-changing moment. Puffed up from this experience, Peter's wondering who amongst Jesus's followers are the greatest, the next in line to glow, so to speak. For an answer, Jesus called over a child and shared how children are essential to the kingdom. I wonder if that caught Peter off guard, that a child, rather than a productive, generous, dedicated follower like one of the disciples, was deemed greatest and essential. Can you imagine how it might feel for a parent with a screaming baby who's stared down by the long timer a row over, if they knew their baby was essential to the kingdom? I wonder how I would have felt in middle school having received an F on my confirmation final exam because I poorly memorized Luther's small catechism. If I had been told children are essential to the kingdom long before they can memorize, confess, prove, or otherwise make a way for themselves as good Christians, I wonder what that child felt like in the Bible, the one pulled aside by Jesus. Did they feel scared or excited to be chosen? I wonder what that little one, perhaps learning to walk, string together words into sentences, would say about that moment. The moment Jesus made plain how children are essential to the kingdom. The best way I can picture it is like a children's message. It's a poor and imperfect connection for sure. Perhaps you don't mind the example because you love children's messages. Perhaps you are on your way to tuning me out already because you really loathe children's messages. I have a theory about children's messages. People who loathe them often do so for the right reasons, because the message often isn't geared towards the kids. It's actually made for the adults at the expense of laughter at the kids. However, a well-crafted children's message that helps them know God at their own developmental level may be the only time in an hour-long worship service that cares if the kids can participate or not. And if our songs are too complicated, or our prayers too verbose, our readings and sermons over their heads, so that children are getting at most 5 minutes of accessible worship, then Jesus' proclaiming children essential to the kingdom of God might sound as radical to us today as it did to the disciples standing around back then. Jesus is asked by his disciples, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus responds in this way. He called a child, whom he put among them, and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." With the question of who's greatest echoing in everyone's ears, with the disciples standing within reach of Jesus, Jesus responds by calling a child from the crowd. Not grabbing Peter's shoulder and pulling him closer, or James' hand and lifting him up over their heads as a sign of victory. Jesus draws a child close and keeps the child there while talking, while explaining the topsy-turvy world that is the kingdom of heaven. A world, a kingdom that children receive because they need it. And adults who understand their need for such a world, like children, are welcome to participate in it. Dependence on God, then, is key to the kingdom, although it's not the only thing. Dependency is one characteristic that children exemplify for us about God's kingdom. Other characteristics include being natural problem solvers, being prone to more easily talk about God, and they see potential for friendship much more so than making an enemy. We can wrap our heads around children as dependents, and most of us have seen how children can easily make friends out of strangers, and also how they say the darndest things about God. So I want to share a few biblical examples of one of the other essential characteristics, problem solving. Think about David. Long before he was king, he showed up to battle in Saul's oversized and ill-fitting armor. Confronted with a literal giant of a problem, the kid David problem solved, deciding to go with what he knew best. He wiggles out of the burdensome armor, and with only his confidence in skill and faith in God, he approaches Goliath with a slingshot and wins. The young Israelite servant girl of Naaman's wife from the book of 2 Kings overhears that Naaman, this renowned commanding general, can't find relief for his disease. Problem solved by speaking up in a circle, but a circle that usually demands her silence. She problem solves by speaking up and finding a solution that, in fact, demanded a change of allegiance for this commander. How dare she do something like that when she wasn't even supposed to be speaking? And yet, her problem solving involved Naaman washing in a river, showing faith in the God of the young Israelite girl, and sure enough, he was healed. Or what about Miriam? Certainly not that much older than her baby brother Moses, who is floating almost to certain death on the Nile. She watches his rescue by Pharaoh's daughter, but doesn't leave it at that. Her ingenuity solves the new problem of needing a wet nurse. With Miriam's convincing, not only is Moses spared drowning, but his mother will continue to be able to nurse him and even get paid for it until he later goes back to live in Pharaoh's house and eventually free the Israelites from slavery. I could go on. As adults, we tend to be set in our ways, underutilizing our creativity, imagination, and ingenuity. Kids' natural tendency to problem solve helps us understand what God means by saying we must be childlike to enter the kingdom of heaven. However, it's not just about individual young people as examples, like David or Miriam. It's about children as a collective, too. God tells Israel throughout the book of Isaiah that children are central to salvation because they are the way God envisions the world should be. Throughout Isaiah, God shows up as a tender mother, committed to her children, the whole Israelite people. This is God's hoped-for reality, where children, playful and safe under a mother's care, and this mothering God remains steadfast to Israel, no matter what. Too often today, we struggle with sentimentalizing children instead of valuing them. But a good mother knows that's not the healthiest. What if it wasn't expected for children to be quiet and listen so they can contribute when they get older, but instead valued as imago Dei, even at the most tender of ages? I wonder if we understood better the language of Genesis chapter 1, that all people are created in the image of God, with no age limits, how that might change the way we teach or have children lead in church. If the image of God isn't something we grow into, but inherently are from the get-go, how would we honor the needs of children's spirituality differently? The Message Bible puts Jesus' words this way: when you receive the childlike on my account, it's the same as receiving me. Perhaps we are more familiar with a later text in the Gospel of Matthew. Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or naked or sick or in prison and did not take care of you? Then he will answer them, truly I tell you, just as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. We welcome Christ in the hungry, thirsty, stranger, prisoner. We welcome Christ in the widowed and orphaned. We also welcome Christ when we welcome children and those who are childlike. Children are essential to the kingdom of God. The placing of a child in the midst of Jesus' disciples represents a child-centered perspective of understanding the way of the cross and the kingdom of heaven. That's a whole new way of looking at discipleship for many of us. Professor Keith White goes as far as to say, children are God's language. Children are how God reveals God's nature, hence the nature of God's kingdom. Insofar as we are in touch with children, we are open to God's chosen language. And don't we want to speak God's chosen language? So when Jesus chooses a child as an example of the kingdom, it is not because Jesus wants the child to repeat, duplicate, or in any way regurgitate certain beliefs. Precisely the opposite. God's chosen language doesn't include Jesus listing the virtues of children as model citizens of the kingdom of heaven. By holding up a child in front of the disciples, Jesus emphasizes the characteristics of children as essential to the kingdom's fulfillment. Dependency, problem solving, sharing about God, loving one's neighbors, just to name a few. Now, isn't that the kind of world we would like to live in? Doesn't that sound like God's preferred kingdom of heaven? It's the difference between wanting children to be what we want them to be and recognizing them for who they are. Same as how we have a way of, how we'd like to know Jesus versus the often sticky, challenging version of who Jesus really is. Are you feeling it? The topsy-turviness of God's vision of the kingdom of heaven. The invitation of Jesus to be childlike and to value children is not meant to be cute. A child has no value compared to those who have made sacrifices for the kingdom, which works out, honestly, because God's kingdom does not work on the principle of human merit, fairness, or effort. And to drive this message home, Matthew makes children the most consistent sign of the kingdom. Yet, somehow, with our adult eyes, we have for far too long overlooked the example Jesus has made of children. Perhaps because for too long we have sentimentalized rather than valued children, imposing our beliefs rather than journeying with them as the spiritual beings that they are. How do we remedy this? Become more childlike ourselves in all the right ways, so that we too aren't left confounded like the disciples, wondering why Jesus put a child at the center of it all. I look forward to discussing in more depth children's essentialness to the kingdom. I'll see you soon.
Welcome back, everybody. Hope you found the video thought-provoking. We've already got a question going, so we'll get ready for that. Please feel free to continue submitting those as we go. So now I introduce to you Janelle Hooper.
Howdy, it is awesome to be with y'all, and thanks for taking the time. I am typically a very practical pastor. If you've been to any of my other workshops, I'm usually on the ground with you doing godly play or something like that. And so this is a different stretch, and I'm glad you've joined me, because I think all of us sometimes just need to go deeper too. You know, sometimes we are holding down the boat with our practical things, and we're okay for now, and we want to go a little deeper. So I created a one-page sheet in Martin's List where you can access the things that we're talking about today and the books that I'm sharing with you today. I just want to highlight that pretty much everything I said comes from this book called The Child in the Bible. And it was edited by Marcia Bunge, who was a professor at Valparaiso University. And it's really thick and small print with lots of footnotes. And so it took me a long time to pick it up off my shelf and decide it was time to read it. And it basically goes from the Old Testament for Genesis to all through the New Testament, and in some ways, book by book of the Bible, and saying, where do children fit in the theology? And so it does make for a good short read. So you can just do chapters by chapters, which is kind of what I did. And they're so rich. Professors of mine like Esther Men, who just are just, you know, so solid and have done the research. And so I was just basically wanted a book study. That's why I did this. I'm like, hey, y'all, somebody else has to read this with me, because it was just like so deep and rich. So I look forward to hopefully connecting with y'all beyond this time together.
Who is the author and editor of that? So I can put it in the chat, Janelle. That was
Marcia, Marcia, Bunge, B as in Barbara, Unge. She's the general editor. And yeah, so then it was a challenge then to take this really thick book and try to do 15 minutes with it. But I tried to stay on and share some of that. And I'll share a few other books in a minute, but we can start with some questions and go from there.
the first question that came out is, do you say kingdom because of relationship with Christ, or why do you say the word kingdom?
Excellent. So that is on my one-page sheet also. It comes from a theologian who started a feminist theologian who started it as an understanding of how we are in relationship with one another as kin. So I'm your kin, you're my kin, and it takes away that patriarchal structure that I'm not sure was intended to last to this century in our understanding of being in relationship with each other.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. The next question is that they heard you talking about godly play. And so, and there's a couple of people who are interested. Do you recommend their trainings or just a playful attitude in general, or say more about that?
Well, awesome. Yeah, I've taught so many trainings on it, classes, just because I want people to ask the I wonder question. And I usually say with my workshops, if that's all you walk away from, you start inviting people to wonder about their faith rather than, like I say, like repeating or that it's binary, then the work of godly play is done. But I do highly recommend the 3-day training. You can go to the Godly Play organization website. It's godlyplayfoundation.org and find a trainer near you. And I have found it immensely helpful. I taught it to Lutheran Outdoor Ministry camp leaders a few years ago, and was just at a mother-daughter retreat myself recently, where one of the people I trained used it for a mother-daughter retreat, and I was like, It's working. It's working. And I just was like, this is the best. Like, it takes years, right? It takes years to disperse, but I think it's one of the best curriculum ways to invite, to do what I talk about in there about it. The point of it is to understand children as Imago Dei from the get-go, that they're spiritual beings. And so you invite them into a sacred story, and you invite them to experience the sacred on their own. And you're just kind of guiding them without telling them what to believe, with the thought that as you journey alongside them, they will come to their own rich understanding that will last them a lifetime of questioning and guidance without having that kind of like backlash or whiplash of, wait, I was told it had to be this, but I haven't thought through it myself. Because from a very young age, like 2 or 3, they're starting to think through things as little theologians themselves.
Mhm. Yeah, speaking of that, I just had a church member send me a message recently and saying, can you do a parenting class on hard questions, because their kids are asking them such hard questions, and they were like, I don't know how to answer these.
Which is also why I highly recommend for like camp settings, because here we have these young adults, right? They're coming from camp. They may not be Bible, literally, they haven't, all this stuff or whatever, but they love kids and they want to be camp leaders. You don't have to be a theologian to do godly play. You have people tell a story, because the children are going to do the interpreting. And you're just going to say, when they say, I wonder if Jesus was like Superman, you're like, I wonder.
Mhm.
And you don't have to answer the question.
You don't have to answer the question. Yeah. I don't know. Let's ask Pastor on Sunday.
Right.
That is totally fine. And sometimes
That's fine too.
And
Sure.
sometimes I don't know, but I don't mind saying that to a child and saying, what do you think? Turning it into a question, just as Jesus did too. What stories did you use at that retreat? And then I want to move on to another question.
At the mother-daughter retreat?
Yes.
Oh, well, they totally made it their own. They did it on Jesus was the vine.
Nice.
And they put it on cubes, and they put different pictures on the cubes, so they kept turning the cubes. So I'm like, oh, what's on the other side of the cube? And then it was like suddenly, you are the vine, we are the branches, and the people became the tree. And I was just like,
that's cool.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so the next question is, how do you empower children in church settings, and especially during this time of COVID, but also in general?
Right. So if you're virtual, like our church is right now, if you're inviting families to say lessons or prayers or such to be videotaped, have the kids do it. They can send in their readings, their prayers, just as much pictures. If you're doing lessons and you want them to put the pictures in for your virtual backgrounds, those sorts of things, those are perfect ways that non-readers and readers can participate virtually. And then the same would go even when you're back in person. Take those pictures. Let those pictures that you're doing over in the kids' corner become the offering that is collected and put in offering plates and brought up. Pretty much say yes to anything a kid asks to do, and literally find a way to do it. They want to count the money, you find an adult who's going to count the money with them. They want to do reading, you practice with them, and you find them a step stool and you have them be a reader. If they, you just find a way to say yes to them, because like any of the rest of us, once you feel like you belong, it makes all the difference in the world.
Awesome. On that note too, then, how do you, and I totally get this question, I totally hear this too in my setting. How do you help acclimate other adults in the congregation to see children and youth as valuable partners? And I love this word, contributors to ministry, not just other members of the church, but just contributors and participants in ministry.
Well, I do hope this book helps. I hope it does give like a foundational background that, when you have a chance to flip through it and something sticks to you, that you're like, that you latch on to that understanding of children in the Bible, and you're able to express that to your church councils, to your staff, and then you just go on repeat about it. So I focus that one text from Matthew because it kind of seems like the most obvious, but there really is a lot of other places, clearly a lot that can be footnoted and put in here or whatever. And I think like once you find that, you just start going on your repeat forever and ever, honestly, because there's new people coming in the church constantly. And so that becomes part of it. And then the other thing too is a book I have on that sheet is called Growing Young. And Yeah, I'll let you put that on there. It's got 3 authors. And the idea behind growing young is that children, our youth, are essential to the church. And you have to be intentional about it. Have to be intentional. So, like I said, it becomes part of your mission statement. It becomes part of, you put it in your bulletin that says, children are welcome to make noise and come to the front. Children, this, you just say it constantly until the people in your pews are like, I know, pastor, I know, deacon, I know, staff leader. You say it all the time. They're so loud over there. And you're like, I know, they're so loud. Isn't that great? And you just have to like own it intentionally. So, and I also, gosh, I've been doing this a long time. And so I know, like, you just start with one step. So like I say, like, you've never done godly play before, pick one Sunday, and make it a non-threatening Sunday, or do it on Thanksgiving, because Thanksgiving, you can do whatever you want. You can't do it on Christmas Eve. You can't just jump in on Christmas Eve, but you can do it on Thanksgiving, right? Or Super Bowl Sunday, or, like, pick something non-threatening, start there and just start working your way. So that's what people expect you to say when you come down the aisle, right?
Right. Well, I think too, even in that question, I was thinking just using that kind of language of, like finding ways in your language to be inclusive of children too, like in all the ways that you speak all the time, so that they hear that as, contributors, partners, those kinds of things. So.
Yeah, you're at one of those big potluck meals you have, ask a kid to pray.
Right.
You just see them as possibilities, because they're just eager. Yep. Adults are scared you're going to pick them. They're like, oh no, they're like, don't pick me. And kids are going to be doing that too. So just ask them anyway and do it with them. That's the other thing too, though. Okay. Right. So you don't, just like anybody else, you don't want to shame anybody, and you don't want to laugh at anybody. You don't want to make anyone stick out a sore thumb. So again, that's the other thing too. Sometimes we push children to do something. Like if the kid was like, I don't want to, you're like, you're gonna do it. Don't do that. They say no, you say okay, just like you would to an adult who said they didn't want to do it. So it's a whole respect them as people with real feelings.
Mm-hmm. I always think it's funny, the people that never volunteer to do things in church are the ones saying, why do we have kids doing this?
Yes.
Maybe if you did, but also because it's really important.
Yes.
Other questions, folks? Good questions so far. Other questions for Janelle?
I'll go ahead and point out 2 other books that I have on my sheet. One is about incorporating children in worship. So it's worship specific. So it's excellent on the background stuff I'm talking about today. So if you want to go deep also, but then particularly focus on worship, incorporating children in worship is an excellent book. And just to speak about worship for a second, I use this, I am practical. I had to give you some practical resources here. This God's Word, My Voice, a lectionary for children. One reason even adults, again, don't want to be lectors is because they have to say, Isaiah and, Jahab and, these names they don't want to say. But can you imagine if we could have someone read the lectionary and just skip over those names? It's not the worst thing in the world. If we just say the family of Matthew instead of reading 30 names in the first chapter of Matthew, and we just say the family of Matthew, we get the point, and then you can read the rest of it. And so there's ways that you can make adults and children feel confident. And so I really love this lectionary. It's in big print. Eric Carlson just came out with a new book called Speak It Plain, Words for Worship and Life Together. The whole idea is about making things in plain language. So the more accessible we can make it for all ages, especially kids that aren't going to understand. And there is a place for teaching them. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying don't ever say the word righteousness. There's definitely a place for righteousness. But can we also use some other words along with that so that they understand one of the 5 times we're talking about being right with God? And so I just looked up that there are some really great new stuff from Augsburg Fortress, out. the last book was Families at the Center of Faith Formation. And this one in particular hits home the importance of why it's not just that it's the church's work to empower families, and what that looks like. If I had to pick out a few books, those are the ones I put on the list.
I wanted to just answer one really quick. Yeah, we are talking for the question that was about, are we talking about younger children and not just youth? Yes, we are definitely talking about the younger children and their curiosity and interest. And so one of the things that someone's asking is what kinds of intergenerational activities or incorporating into worship or whatever have you found the most successful?
I think ushering has always been pretty easy. You stand with an adult because there's an adult right there. And, many churches tend to be older grandpas doing the ushering or whatever. And sometimes they just make the best mentors, helping the kid out or whatever. That's pretty easy. Feel free to go way beyond the acolyte and crucifer where they just have to walk and be silent. They can get really bored sat there. So I turned my acolytes and crucifers into communion assistants and not just carrying the tray to receive it, because again, that's just a receiving quiet action. But can you imagine asking a young person then to be a part of, the blood of Christ shed for you? That really flips the tables for their involvement and engagement in it. Speaking of Ash Wednesday, that we just had, and then my church for Lent, throughout Lent, then we did healing prayers in the sanctuary during communion, where we would lay hands and use oil and put it on people's forehead, and prayer anybody could come to us. Well, my husband and I did it with our kids who are in elementary school, and so the people would come forward and our kids would lay hands on their head and put the oil on their forehead, and then one of us as an adult would say the prayer for it. Pretty, again, so you're doing it with them so they don't feel, like if I had asked them to do it by themselves, they never would have done it. Another great thing for youth is usually the tech board or the sound system or any of that stuff that our digital natives are often more well equipped than we are. And again, if you're like, I don't want a 12-year-old back there by themselves, great. Just plug them in with another mentor. Honestly, the more mentoring, the better you are off anyway. The more people who love on your children is all for the better. So better to not leave them hanging anyway. Mm-hmm. Those are some of the easiest.
Yeah. Well, and I found like one of the ways to really get adults and children involved together is interactive prayer stations for the prayers of the people, because everybody wants to get up and move about, not just the kids.
And light a candle. I mean, come on, let's do it.
Right.
Absolutely. Or write a name and shove it in a board. Yeah.
Yep. Play prayer Jenga. Yeah. Somebody had asked in the chat box, or noticed that you had called them essential workers, or essential, that youth or children are essential workers with us. Was there intentionality, and say more about what you mean by that?
Yeah. So they're essential, not just because they're cute to have around. And I think we're like, oh, they're cute. And they're going to be the next generation at church. And so that's great. And so traditionally we love kids. Traditionally we have Sunday school for little kids because we're like, oh, kids. But do we consider them as contributors? Again, going back to kind of the offering of their coloring sheets, do we see them offering something? Do they have a need to offer something to God? So we're here in worship and we're talking about stewardship and offering, and they see their parents perhaps put something on a plate or something like that, and the kids are like, not for me, I don't. But what if from the very young age they are invited to offer something into that plate? So and some churches I've seen, tape or glue dot pictures up to the altar, and so they see that what they are offering is valued, and they too are invited to offer something to God. And the last two churches that I've been at, my family has been the only one where the kids put money in the offering plate. And both churches have been like, whoa, we didn't even think about giving kids. And my kids are in elementary school. They're not even confirmation. And I'm like, ooh, you're not even giving them to your confirmants? I'm like, come on now. we say we want these things, these values, but we're not going to teach it to them till confirmation, and then we don't really expect them to do it in confirmation. I mean, kids have money now, they've allowance, whatever, they have it. So I just think that valuing like the same needs you have for yourself, like the same parts of the worship service, whether that means to belong in communion, um, or it means to belong in, like I said, I could go on and on about the offering, but just thinking of the same things that you need. If we really say we value the kids, then we're going to try to wait to allow them to participate at their developmentally appropriate age level, because they too want to be workers in the kingdom. You have kids. If you see kids around, they're trying to imitate what other people are doing. I mean, I was trying to imitate what the pastor was doing when I was a little kid, right? You're just and so if we're talking one thing, but we're not allowing them to participate at their developmental level, then they're going to be bored by the time we're like, why aren't you doing this at the age we want them to be doing it? Because they've been shut out from doing it for so long, and they thought, you never engaged me in it for the last 15 years. Why do you care now? Because now I'm a teenager and I don't care. We set ourselves up.
Mm-hmm. Yep. How do you, speaking of kind of like making things appropriate, how do you make language and music kid appropriate and blend that in with a traditional service?
Yeah, so I was just talking with one of our preschools in Florida that has a chapel song that they sing Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday in chapel. And then one of those songs is going to show up on a Sunday morning. So we're talking, any of you who plan worship, you got songs galore, maybe even like 3 songs during communion, right? Could one of those songs be the chapel song? It will go the longest way in the kid feeling like they're participating in something that, is familiar to them, that they were doing 5 days, and now on Sunday, it just goes a really long way. So again, we're not asking it to be a kid's service. We're just saying or the same thing we were talking about earlier, any coloring sheets or anything they've been working on. And I just saw something in the chat, like if they're collecting soaps and all that stuff too, or whatever, can that be brought into the Sunday worship so that they're making that connection? They're seeing their gifts valued.
Mm-hmm. I remember one year, one of our pastors actually, instead of doing the Lord's Prayer for communion, they did the Come Lord Jesus, Be Our Guest. And so many of the kids were just like, oh, wait, what? I know this one.
Exactly. Perfect. Yes. Can't we do that? And we don't have to do it maybe for the entire year, but if we do it for our season, we can do it for a season, right? Right? We can switch it up.
Yeah. Say some more specifics about how you might involve babies and toddlers.
One of the most important things is to allow them to, again, they know they're welcome. So, putting that in the bulletin, making sure you have an adult who comes over to them and says, after they were screaming all day and they're, coming out the side door, we were so glad to hear your kid participating in worship today. Call it out and name it and say thank you for it. Otherwise our silence, their parents, new parents, young, parents of little kids, they're ashamed or, anyway, they're feeling guilty anyway. And so and they shouldn't, or maybe, loves having them in there, but nobody tells them that, they're going to feel that. So the intentionality, again, just goes a really long way. So I've seen pastors who have kids who help lead worship with their kids on their hip. They're up there at the altar with one hand on the kid, one hand doing this. I think allowing not just pastors, but lay leaders in whatever way, shape, or form are participating in service to be a part of that, whether they're bringing up the offering as a family and you see, the little kid who's one, you hand it to, the kid can't even walk, but you hand them the offering plate and they can hand it to the pastor. It just seems like a lot of extra work, and it is. But again, it's going back to valuing that kid, showing the parents how much you value them, all of those things. So really, I can't think of any place that they don't belong. one special place which I did with baptisms is invite them up to the font, invite them to do a drum roll with their legs, and just have them have the front row seats. And even so, they don't have to come up if they don't want to. They can stay in their seats, but just the invitation. And then again, the congregation gets to expect, oh, the children are going to come up, the children are going to make noise, like we're going to do a drum roll, like we're going to. So wherever you can.
Well, and I think you would say too, there's a difference between, I think, allowing anybody, I mean, all the kids to just be there and do whatever they're going to do. You still teach kids appropriate behavior in church, but you can also give them some freedom. I was so impressed with a family that visited one time, and the mom let the toddler just walk around. The toddler walked around the sanctuary, just back up and forth. They'd go all the way to the front and all the way to the back. And she just quietly walked with, both silent, making no noise. Whenever the child started to make noise, she'd remind her that they needed to be quiet, but they could wander a little. It was just really neat to see the two of them participating together, definitely participating together and finding ways that were and weren't appropriate. So,
and when a parishioner says, oh, it's distracting having them go back and forth, and our response could be, look at that mother and kid participating. And that's what we're here for, right? So that they can participate. And, and I understand if it's distracting a little bit, they're doing the best that they can. Maybe you want to sit over here where they're not in your purview or something like that, right? Because the end goal is to have people participating. And yes, it has to be appropriately quiet at certain times or this or that or whatever. I'm not saying like just let chaos reign. But yeah, we can do this. Both of my kids have ADHD, so Lord knows they don't want to sit there for all that time sitting. Trust me, they don't.
Well, I had somebody tell me too when I was a parent of a toddler, your job right now is to not worship by listening, but it's to worship by teaching. And I was like, wow, that's really a great idea to think about, though, that that you are worshiping. It's not that you aren't worshiping when you're a mom trying to deal with your kids, that you are worshiping, and you're worshiping in a different way by modeling and teaching, and eventually that goes away. They grow up and you don't have to deal with that anymore. So
exactly. And the younger you start modeling it, the sooner that'll come for them. But it is painful for a while.
Oh yeah, definitely.
No joke.
Okay, so we've got so many questions. This is good. And we've only got 10 minutes left. This is my 10-minute warning. So I'll try to go through these quickly. What about training for non-parents? Like, how do you help? And then maybe in conjunction too, there was a question about people who love to work with kids, but that really means they just want to lecture about the Bible stories. So how do you train non-parents or non-kid friendly people, or people who are kid friendly, but need to learn a little bit more?
For like teaching Sunday school or something like that, is maybe that the context?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the context. It just said training for non-parents, maybe. To help understand the importance of kids in all of this too.
So 2 different ideas. One is, and I'm working on this at my church too, every church needs to have a safe haven policy where you're doing background checks and having policies and safeguarding for how you work with kids. And when you do that training, whatever that looks like in your place, you might also incorporate what it takes to be a teacher of kids and that sort of thing. But then also annually, you're going to want to do a short catch up with your teachers. And it can be as short or as long or as video or a paper or like whatever is going to get it across in your context, which will also include skills for that. In addition to that, you might need to pair them up with someone who understands the setting a little better. So maybe it's a matter, if you can pair 2 people together, you need 2 people in a room anyway. Like, how can you do that? Or you pull them aside. I'm not too shy. I've told my pastor how to do some children's messages. Which I just want to make note. Also in Martin's list, I have my 7 pro tips for a children's message. So 7 pro tips. And so I did nicely forward that to my pastor and said, anytime you want to talk about this, happy to talk about it with you. And it also has to do with the curriculum you pick too. So again, the godly play what you need are two people, one who's willing to be a storyteller and one who's willing to like manage the kids in the room. And none of that involves lecturing at kids. So if you're trying to like wholeheartedly move someone from a different style, you might just completely change their curriculum and say, you have, you've got great gifts and that really fits this style. Are you willing to learn a new style? Maybe they don't like the way they teach, maybe or maybe they do. And then maybe you're like, let's try to find you a different group or a different setting. None of this is easy.
Right?
I'm working with old school teachers who've been teaching the same class for 20 years. And I'm just like, try to change the ship just a little bit. So
Yep.
trust me, these are not easy.
Yep. How do we keep from alienating people who don't have kids so that we don't make the focus so much on families that the people who don't or can't feel alienated?
Yeah, and I think it comes with that intentionality of our language again. Just for a kind of wacky example, these chips that I like to buy, when they come in the big package, they're usually called, what is it, like family size, right? So instead of the little individual, you get the family size. And the chips that I like, they just changed it from saying family size to sharing size. And I was like, oh, yeah, sharing size. And so I think like, well, we're just in our language instead of like, families are this, or, where can we just say, like, my good friend Linda Stotts likes to use the word household because household can embrace more different groups, especially in this time of COVID and bubbles, like bubble groups, like who's your close group? Like, how can we find different language for that? Intergenerational, if the event is truly intergenerational, sometimes that helps. Oftentimes that means it's like a kid's craft and their grandparents. That's why you have to be intentional about having it not be that. And reach the young adult section. Again, until we do our work as a church and we have more than one young adult, they're going to feel awkward and out of place anyway. Until you find a niche for them. Perhaps they sing and you're going to go out of your way to make sure they have a ride to choir and people who love on them in choir, so that becomes their home. You're just going to have to go out of your way because they're not in our church and they're not going to feel welcome again. Yeah, if it's family centered.
Well, and somebody else's question was, how do you emphasize that we're all family, kind of tied to that? And so maybe it's even partly putting it in your worship welcome statement that we are a family church, but family means this to us, inclusive of everybody, that we are baptized into the family of Christ. And so we are all essentially family.
Yeah, it's that sense of belonging. I think so. Maybe if you dig deeper into what you mean by family, like we're a church where, you're going to feel like you belong. Like we're not going to let you out of our sight. We're going to find people to love on you and that sort of thing. So maybe if we dig deeper in our words or our language or our expressions, and then you have to live it out because young people want authenticity. So yeah. We could go on about that.
Well, it's about 5 more minutes left. I have one more question for sure. We may have room for one more, just depending. But what are your thoughts on special family areas or special spaces set aside for kids during worship?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think we want people in worship. We want them there. We want them participating as much as possible. So whatever fits in your context. Having a station for kids up front, in the back, somewhere that they feel comfortable and is like as you were mentioning, Heather, like you either it's the parents have to be there or you have to have a trained person there. So we're not just saying they have free reign and they can make noise, right? So do those kinds of things. If your church doesn't need that, your church doesn't need that. Like maybe the kids sit with their coloring bags next to their parents or their auntie or whoever, and it works just fine. So I think the church I grew up in was a very high church. We didn't have announcements because when you got to worship, there were no announcements. It was worship. There's no kids message. And so it's like funny, like these days I'm like kids message. Like I didn't grow up with that, but I just felt essential to that church. And so that did it enough for me. But So it's whatever fits your context. As long as people feel valued and capable of participating, whatever that looks like, and it might change. Maybe one time you have an autistic kid that's really a family who's really involved and they need to be running back and forth. And so that's what you do. And then 10 years later, they graduate and you realize you don't need that kind of same system that you did before. So I think just that problem solving I talked about today as a part of the kingdom, I think that really is essential to our church. We have to be problem solvers and we have to be willing to adapt. And that doesn't mean for all time or for everybody. It just means that, the best we can so people feel welcome in worship. We want to have like the least restrictive environment, as welcoming as we possibly can, hopefully so that we feel challenged almost every Sunday, being like, gosh, I don't like, saying this, but I know it makes a difference. So I'm going to do it because that's the most important thing, is making people feel.
Yep. Well, and what an opportunity for intergenerational ministry too. I mean, this gets into all sorts of, questions about how do you make sure people are safe and things like that. But at the same time, if every family with children could have an adopted grandparent family or something like that, where if you do want to be involved in the service, they have somebody to sit with while you're up front, or things like that just make it, or maybe there's some older folks in your congregation that are maybe a little crabby because their grandkids aren't close by. So if they're complaining, maybe ask if they'd like to help. Something like that too. So, well, we are coming to the close. Any last remarks that you want to make, Janelle, before we're finished today?
Just thank you for taking the time. And I do feel like you're here because you love children and you love the church. And I do hope you do take time to try that book out, or something that does replenish you in the midst of all of this adapting that we're having to do, and all of this, I have 2 kids showing up for my Sunday school class, and so we're loving it and we're adapting and we're taking classes on webinars, how to run webinars and all this stuff. But maybe you need to go deeper and replenish yourself. And I think now is the time also to come back to our church councils and our whatever your leadership group is, and say, how can we continue to adapt for the future when we come back, or whenever we're doing things differently, and just really be intentional about all ages, and just use this as an opportunity for that. And so thank you for coming today to hear about it. Children are valued in God's kingdom. They're throughout the Bible valued. And when I spent that time in Isaiah, and I just thought, God's whole idea is like God's vision is like to be a mother to these wandering Israelites, and they're like kids, and like that's God's preferred vision. I mean, like, holy cow, God's preferred vision, involves childlike characteristics. God wants to love us like that. And so I think that, we're talking about divisive stuff, politics and all this stuff. You can't hammer people with facts, right? You got to love them with a story, love them into a story. So I think that's what spoke to me, was returning to this book and the Bible, and hearing these stories of how God has been engaging and inviting child-centered and understanding for a long time, so that I'm not just like hammering a nail on a wall about stuff. So find your way to tell that story. And thank you for all you do, because I think most of us are here because of something that made us feel we connected with God and the church at a young age. So don't ever doubt that what you're doing is planting seeds, for sure. So thank you for your ministry.
Thank you, Janelle, so much. Everybody give her like silent snaps on your mute button. Thanks so much for presenting for us. And Julie, thanks for keeping us going smoothly today, and all of your websites and everything you put up there. And thank you.
One more thing. Can I say one more thing? I run a website for the ELCA. I should mention that. It's called ELCAfaithformation.org. It's a really good website. I've been running it for 5 years. It's got a lot of resources on there. So if you're wondering why all these resources aren't on the ELCA website, know that they're on the ELCAfaithformation.org website, and we're here for you.
Yeah, thank you. Good plug there. And it's a great source.